How does one remake a classic, paying attention to the tradition but also making it their own? Well, that is exactly what the 1965 version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella attempted to do. Let's discuss it.
Welcome to Let's Chat, the podcast where we discuss movies, TV, and theater like old friends. I am your host, Dee, a casual consumer of visual media who enjoys chatting about them.
Today we discuss Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella from 1965, starring Leslie Ann Warren. The synopsis from the official website of Rodgers and Hammerstein reads as follows. Cinderella, forced into a life of household chores by her wickedly cruel stepmother and stepsisters, dreams of a better life. The town crier announces a royal ball at which the prince of the kingdom intends to find a bride, and Cinderella wishes that she could attend. When her stepsisters and stepmother go off to the ball, a fairy godmother appears and magically grants Cinderella's wish. At the ball, Cinderella and the prince dance and instantly fall in love, but she abruptly excuses herself at midnight, leaving only a glass slipper on the palace steps. After an extensive search throughout the kingdom, the prince and Cinderella are magically reunited and blissfully married. This musical stars Leslie Ann Warren as Cinderella, Jo Van Fleet as Cinderella's stepmother, she's not given a name, Pat Carroll as stepsister Prunella, Barbara Ruick as stepsister Esmeralda, Ginger Rogers as Queen Constantina, Walter Pidgeon as King Maximilian, Stuart Damon as Prince Christopher, and Celeste Holm as Fairy Godmother. Director Charles S. Dubin is on hand to show us his version of this tale as old as time. What was your relationship to this? Let me know. I'll tell you my relationship to the 1965 version. I don't recall the first time that I saw the 1965 version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. Was it TV? Was it DVD? Not sure, but the Leslie Ann Warren version of Cinderella was something that was in the zeitgeist growing up. One had seen clips of it in retrospectives. One had seen images of it. It just seemed to be everywhere. I definitely recall watching this movie before seeing the original 1957 one with Julie Andrews. The 1965 version of Cinderella aired on CBS, as had the original. However, the most noticeable difference between the two, other than that the earlier one is in black and white and this one is in color, the most noticeable difference is the set. The Dubin version feels as though one has entered a fairy tale book because they begin with a gate that opens to reveal a 2D castle in the distance. The original version, directed by Ralph Nelson, has a set that feels a little more simple and abstract. There were curtains where a wall ought to be because presumably with the live television cameras, there would be a need to move around and actors would need to move quickly to sprint to their places. Moving a curtain would facilitate these quick moves. So because the 1965 version was filmed, they had time to create a more substantial set. This access to more advanced technology means that they could create a set with real flames in the fireplace where Cinderella sits and gets soot on her face. Soot that easily comes off with a quick edit when she magically transforms into a gown for the ball. If the Cinderella of the live version in 1957 were to have soot on her face, which she does not, she would not have had time to scrub it off, the actor wouldn't have, and reapply a full face of makeup and change of clothes during a 30-second commercial break. So in the 57 version, you have to imagine that Cinderella has soot somewhere rather than to see it on her person. So the filmed version of this story helps to give time to the actors, the sets, the costumers, to give us some substantial designs or to go into and to do things that we otherwise would not have the time to do. Other things that stand out to me include the fact that the Nelson version in the 1950s starts with a crowd scene on the square. Everyone is bustling around and chatting about the prince giving a ball. This is a standard musical theater positioning of the crowd song to introduce you to the setting, the vibe, what's important in the community. I'm reminded of the song Tradition in Fiddler on the Roof, which helps us to understand the setting and the desires of the town while introducing some of the characters. On the other hand, this version of Cinderella, the Dubin version, starts quietly with the prince riding a horse in the woods and happening upon Cinderella's house where she is alone. There are no crowds. They simply have a quiet conversation. Then the prince and his retinue move on. So somewhere between Cinderella's house and the castle, the prince stops, gets off of his horse, and sings a ballad called The Loneliness of Evening, which, according to the official Rodgers and Hammerstein website, was cut from their other musical, South Pacific. This is an I Want song, yearning for someone out there. The prince wordlessly greets his parents after he's finished his song, and then we're on to our first commercial break. So in this version, the Dubin version, we are noticeably more contemplative up front than in the original Cinderella. Another aspect that stands out upon rewatching this one is how the comedy is still there, but there is more of a distinction between the royals and everyone else. The broad comedy of being loud and pulling faces, I want a chance at him, belongs more, that's one of the stepsisters says that, belongs more to the stepmother and stepsisters as a way to suggest that they do not belong with the prince and his court, who conduct themselves in a more stately and sober manner. For instance, in the 1957 one, the royals are introduced with the king in a state of undress as the queen attempts to sew his trousers that no longer fit. There is a sight gag of the king attempting to squeeze himself into his old clothes to no avail. However, in the 1965 version, the king and queen are introduced in full costume with no jokes about the king's expanding gut. The casting is helpful here in suggesting authority and respect. Academy Award nominated Walter Pidgeon as the king is reminiscent to me of other roles where the actor plays someone with authority, such as the stern admiral in Hit the Deck, who must punish his own son for conduct unbecoming a sailor. Also, we have Ginger Rogers as the queen, who is an Academy Award-winning actor, who at this point in time is a legend for her roles from 20 or 30 years prior. Miss Rogers is also a dancer, which helps in her portrayal of a queen who conducts herself in quiet elegance. Their comedy comes from dialogue more than sight gags. For instance, when the king expresses delight at the sight of Cinderella and the prince dancing, he says, "When I was his age," and the queen is quick to interrupt, "When you were his age, you had the good sense to fall in love with me." "Quite right," the queen agrees, "and I hope he has equally good sense." That is the humor you get with this set of royals in the remake of Cinderella. It's gentle, and it connects very well with what we have witnessed at the beginning of the show. We see the prince quietly speaking to Cinderella for the first time. He sings a ballad. He wordlessly greets his parents, and then we're on to the first commercial. It is only after that break that we're treated to zaniness and wackiness, and that's introduced by the stepmother and her daughters. That distinction between the royals' humor and that of everyone else will change again in the 1997 version that hews more closely to the original on this, with a queen who squeaks and peeps and dramatically calls for her smelling salts when her son doesn't agree with her. Another change from the 1957 movie is in that one, where the fairy godmother leans into her impish classic fairy mischief. She's kind of cruel. Whereas here in the 1965 version, played by Celeste Holm, the one sent to help Cinderella is kind. So the famous words fal-de-ral and fiddly-dee, fiddly-faddly-fuddle, all the dreamers in the world are poppycock and twaddle, are prefaced with the idea that the fairy godmother is merely quoting other people. The sensible people say fal-de-ral. And at least twice when Cinderella asks for help, the fairy godmother says something to the effect of, well, of course, what is a fairy godmother for? And so over and over again, we see the Celeste Holm version of the fairy godmother reassure Cinderella that she's going to be fine. Whereas the original one is a little more interested in tormenting Cinderella before she helps her, which is a strange but interesting turn of events. Yeah, so the remake makes the fairy godmother a little nicer to our heroine. Recommendations. Of course, I would recommend the other two versions of this movie. The original from 1957 with Julie Andrews as Cinderella, and also the 1997 version with Brandy as the title character.
This has been Let's Chat with Dee. See you next time.